Hi, welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for December 16th, 2022. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one of a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other work related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Our last Friday Forum brought you the three developers of Hazard Aware, a website that brings hazard, risk, and mitigation information to public and community decision makers. Next month, we have two Friday Fora. On January 13th, Professor Hussam Mahmoud will present a new mathematical model of wildfire damage. And then 2 weeks later, on January 27th, Laura Zizzo will talk about climate disclosure information. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Potvin, who will tell us about the links between land use, atmospheric CO2 concentration, and climate change. Professor Potvin is a biologist and an expert in global climate change based at McGill University. Her research focuses on the need to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in the tropics. Among her many academic activities, the one that most intrigued me was her leadership of the Sustainable Canada Dialogues, an initiative to propose a blueprint for Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy. Before our speaker begins, here is our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for about half that time. Then I will moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speaker's slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who could not attend, please let them know. And now I will turn it over to our speaker, Professor Potvin. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
It's my pleasure, although I'm not sure whether I should be reassured that the Catastrophic Loss Institute is interested in that, or I should be afraid. Anyway, I suppose it shows that climate change, the problems coming with climate change are making their way more and more, all around us, understanding the importance of that. So I assume, but I don't really know who you are. So I'm going to start with a few basic facts. This is not a lecture about my research. It's more, concepts that I think most people still haven't fully grasped the importance of that for our collective future on planet Earth. And talking about planet Earth, I love this image. So I'm going to do shameless publicity for Globaya. It's a Montreal-based firm that specialize themselves in making beautiful images about bleak situation of the environment. So in this image, in yellow, you see fumes of carbon dioxide. And in the darker green, you see places where carbon dioxide globally is taken up by the biosphere. And there's one thing that's really important, or that strikes me from this image, I suppose all of you can see that, is that emissions tend to come from the Northern Hemisphere, right? So it's North America, Europe, and of course, a part of Asia, China, and India. If we are, I gather you see my mouse moving on the screen. So if you look in the tropics of Latin America or Africa, these are emissions coming from land use change, which is the topics of today. But you can see that in magnitude, they're nothing like the emissions from industry. So that's just sort of to give us this world perspective. And the second thing I would like to say, because, I'm talking often, I'm quite obsessed by climate change. I did my PhD on climate change. So I talk a lot about that. And sometimes I feel people maybe they question why I'm obsessed by climate change, because in Canada, easily in 1 year, we experience 60-degree difference in temperature. And we're all up in the air now, scientists like me, about 1.5-degree difference or 2-degree difference. So why would that matter if on a yearly basis, our ecosystem bounce over 60 degrees? Well, during the last ice age, I don't know where you are, but over Montreal, there was a kilometer of ice. A kilometer of ice for a global temperature decrease of minus 1.5. So now imagine the impact on ecosystem of a plus 1.5. This is what we're trying to do, maintain the planet within that boundary. And I find that this image is maybe the more powerful, I know, to get people to say, yeah, that's fairly serious, you know? Who would want to live with 1 kilometer of ice above your head? And that's exactly the magnitude we're looking at, but reverse, 1.5 warmer. Okay, so maybe before I get going on what I want to talk to you about, a little bit about me. It's always useful to know where people come from to understand what they're telling you. So I was trained as a quite serious scientist. I did a master's degree in plant biochemistry and then a PhD on tree physiology, photosynthesis. So with these little instruments, we measure the rate at which plants take up carbon dioxide. But with our instruments, we calibrate them with the ambient air. And the scientists that were the cohort of my PhD advisor in the 1980s are the first scientists that suddenly, amongst the first scientists that realized there was something wrong with the ambient carbon dioxide, because every year it was higher. Because we were using that to calibrate our work. We literally saw carbon dioxide go up year by year. So it means it's my lifetime. I've been doing climate change work all my life. I'm interested in the link between this molecule, carbon dioxide, and the atmosphere. There's one thing that we know from carbon dioxide is it's a heat trapping gas. So it takes up heat. And therefore, if there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the planet, it takes up more heat. And for us, people like me who worked with photosynthesis, it's tangible. These instruments, they're called infrared gas analyzer. And the way they detect carbon dioxide is by shining infrared on the leaf and measuring the reduction in infrared after photosynthesis occurred. Okay, so for me, climate change is very concrete because I've lived it. I've seen this. I think in English you have this beautiful word we don't have in French, serendipity. Serendipity made me be named as a negotiator at the Framework Convention of Climate Change on behalf of Panama. And I was a negotiator at the UN Climate Change Conference for 7 years. That means Panama doesn't have a big delegation like Canada, it's a very small one. So if you're a negotiator, you actually get to speak to China and the US and Canada. So that's what I did. And I negotiated the topics related to forests. So I'm a biologist, but I have, I would say, a solid hands-on experience of international policy. And what I like to do, and sometimes I still get to do that, is do field work, and I measure forest carbon in the tropics. So just, this picture is nice. Look at this. This is just a root. It's not a tree. You can imagine the tree behind the root. So of course, the tropical forest has astonishing, carbon stocks, and that's, feeds a lot of my thinking and my research. So this is so much for who I am. What I want to cover with you is really 3 points. I've been trying to address risk since you're a risk institute. So I'm going to simply talk to you about flux and stock as a biologist sees them or a botanist sees them. And then I'm going to present two risks. Maybe the first risk is not a risk, but I still think it's a risk. But the second one is certainly a risk. It's the tipping point risk. Okay, so here are some basic for us ecologists. So we understand carbon in part of a cycle. It's the global carbon cycle. There is a project that's been going on for more than 20 years. It's called the Global Carbon Project. It's a bunch of scientists, nerds, that measure carbon dioxide in different pieces of the biosphere. And we're trying to make a budget from that. So how much do we emit? How much do we capture? And where do we store that? That's the traditional way ecosystem people work. So so every year the Global Carbon Project reports the global carbon budget of the planet. So this is the citation here. You can Google it. It's really a well done report, very serious. And why is it important? Because it's telling us year after year, what is the increasing amount of carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere? This being, of course, the motor of the change in climate. So if I manage to get you all really up to date with flux and stocks after this talk, I'm going to be really happy, because I think people tend to not really fully get that. So if we're looking at the right part of this slide, this is the natural carbon cycle. The natural carbon cycle has two components. It has an oceanic component and a terrestrial one. And I'm not going to talk about the oceanic. I'm a terrestrial biologist. I'm a botanist. I don't work with algae. So I'm going to talk about land, because the title was land use. Okay, so, but you should know that the ocean is a net uptake of carbon. And you saw that in my first slide, there was dark blue in the ocean. So the ocean is our friend until now. And I don't know much more than that, so I'm going to leave that aside. The second part of the natural carbon cycle, is the terrestrial vegetation. And so here there are two differences. So we can look at fluxes. So the biosphere, terrestrial biosphere, takes up carbon through photosynthesis. So trees, they feed on carbon dioxide. That's the molecule they use to produce sugar to grow. And for somebody like me, well, I'm a bit obsessed, I mentioned it, but if I'm looking at a tree, half of the weight of a tree is carbon, okay? So carbon, in essence, plays the same role as protein for us, mammals, right? So we need proteins and plants need carbon. So through photosynthesis, plants pick up carbon. And that's this positive flux that you see here. And you see that it's huge. It's a very big flux. It is the single biggest flux on Earth, positive flux, taking it up. Currently, there is a negative flux. Okay, land is also emitting carbon dioxide. So in yellow here, you see the land use flux. Why is land emitting? Strictly because of us humans. This is cutting forest, burning forest, changing the use of the land. So that's why we talk about land use flux, okay? But you see that overall, that math is simple. There is a positive two effect of the biosphere on the global carbon cycle. Regardless of the fact that we humans are emitting carbon dioxide through the way we interact, with the land, the terrestrial biosphere still captures 2 gigatons per year. So it's a big flux that is positive. Okay, so where does the carbon go? Well, it goes into a stock. Okay, so a flux takes up, and then a stock it stores. Okay, sometimes you can hear about carbon store. So there are major stores of carbon. There's the permafrost, so all the frozen peatland of the Arctic, it's gigantic. And then there's the soil and vegetation store. So all the carbon that is in the tree themselves and in the soil and in the roots of trees. So the amount of carbon, the largest amount of carbon that we have on planet Earth is the combination of permafrost and vegetation. So if you think long-term and catastrophe, what I'm going to try to convince you about is that if these stocks get released in the atmosphere, we're doomed. Just look at the numbers. Just look at how much carbon is stored in the terrestrial biosphere. It's immense. So we should be aiming at making sure these things don't get released. The gray, the gray part of the carbon cycle is the anthropogenic effect, and it's the taking up coal reserve, oil reserves, and gas reserves, burning that and putting that in the atmosphere. And this is how much gigaton we're expelling in the atmosphere every year. So we're expelling much more than the great terrestrial biosphere can soak up. So the first and foremost thing we should do if we are serious about, climate change is watch out these. And I don't know if you thought that, but of course, coal, oil, and gas, this comes from decomposed plant material, right? I'm not a geologist, so I could not explain to you exactly how this happened, but sometime under certain characteristics of soil pressure and temperature, plant that die and decays turned into coal, oil, and gas. So basically what we're doing by extracting these fossil fuel is we're very, very rapidly putting back in the atmosphere plant material that died and decomposed over millions and millions and millions of years. And we're doing that very fast. This started post-World War II, the real acceleration. We call that the Great Acceleration. Okay, so there's a real important element of time here. Okay, so going back to the land, we conceive probably three main. I'm not into agriculture here. I'm thinking forest because that's where carbon is, right? Most carbon is anyway. So there's three most important land use that I would like you to start playing with in your head. So there's deforestation. So what happens to stock and flux when you deforest? Well, the stock is the amount of carbon in the forest. So if you deforest, you reduce your stock, and you probably generate a flux. The flux comes in particular in the tropics from burning the forest. In the tropics, people are not really into timber, a bit, but not so much, but they're into land for agriculture. So they cut the forest, they burn it, and then the carbon dioxide in the tree immediately gets to the atmosphere. If you cut the forest and you let the tree decompose, it's taking a little bit more time for the carbon dioxide to go in the atmosphere. Reforestation attempts to inverse the process, right? So by reforestation, you plant trees. So you're aiming at reconstructing stocks and creating a negative flux. So a flux that takes up carbon dioxide, okay? You try to inverse deforestation by reforestation. But there's an important timeline, and I'll come back to that. When you cut a forest, the stock is a stock of carbon accumulated over 150 years, 100 years, 150 years, wherever you are doing that. But when you reforest, you plant a tiny little tree. That will take 100 years, 150 years before it has the same stocks as the stocks that were destroyed, right? So in time-wise, it's not the same. The action of deforestation immediately reduces your stock, but the action of reforestation takes a long time before you reconstruct your stocks. And the last one is forest conservation. So if you have forest conservation, you don't change your stock. All of that carbon in the biomass of trees and in the soil stays there. You don't act on that. And sometimes there's a question mark because it depends on the forest and we're not so sure, and it depends where, and it depends how climate change will affect all of that. the forest seems to have a small negative flux. When I say negative, it's just the way we calculate photosynthesis. It's a positive thing to have a negative flux. It means I'm taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But that's a small flux. Trees pick up more carbon dioxide when they grow than a stable forest. However, the difference in stock is huge. So I hope I haven't lost you all too much on land use, stocks, and flux, but they're the main character of my story. Okay, so about carbon stock, where are they? And here we should feel like, okay, it resonates at home. Okay, I work in the tropics. That's not home for you. So the tropics have the highest stocks per, probably per hectare of the world, because they have huge trees. They're 60-meter tall, in Indonesia up to 80-meter tall. So these are carbon giants. And somewhat, quite a bit of carbon below ground. So of course, these are the above ground stocks and these are the below ground stocks. But look at us here, the boreal. So we have the single largest soil stocks. Not so much in the above ground. Our conifers aren't that great, but in some parts of Canada, we also have cool temperate, also with very strong soil stocks, okay? So in Canada, we have very important ecosystem for the balance of the world, in terms of forests. The two most important forests are the boreal, because it's a very extensive forest, and the tropical, because it's a very large forest, okay? So clearly, if the goal is to maintain carbon dioxide in the ground, we need to pay attention to maintaining those stocks, not cutting them, not burning them, and ensuring that they function and they remain stocks, because we don't want that stuff to get in the atmosphere. Flux, well, everybody knows these kinds of stories. I talk about Brazil here, but we had major forest fire in Alberta over the past years. And we have a complete destruction of many, many thousands of hectares because of the bark pine beetle in British Columbia. So these are fluxes. These are moments where the forest, in this case, goes up in smoke, okay? So all the carbon dioxide that was there is burned, okay? So that's the flux, that's the concern. If we're looking now at where are these different processes, I want to, walk slowly through this this figure. It also comes from the most recent global carbon budget for the planet Earth. So this is not so nice as my first slide, the real slide of fossil fuel emissions. Okay, so again, same pattern. Fossil fuel emissions are something largely of us, the rich countries of the Northern Hemisphere, plus China and India, well, more or less. And land use emissions, there's something about, the Indo-Malaysian Peninsula, Central Africa, this is the Central African forest, and of course, related to the Amazon basin. And these are the land sinks. So this is where, the important sinks. So going back home, so you see the importance of the sink that we have in Canada, big country with a big terrestrial sink. And when I'm saying here, beware of geopolitics, it's because of what I'm going to talk, as I keep going now, what the next step, which is if we're looking at what's currently happening in climate change policy globally. So I'm not going to talk about the Canadian government, but globally, there seems to be very little appetite, to be frank, to deal with fossil fuel emissions. And instead, countries like Canada, Norway, UK, European Union, whatever, we're all trying to get developing nations, tropical nations, to deal with their deforestation. We are not certainly hearing in Canada as much pressure on our oil industry reduce its emissions as we're hearing about Brazil and the Amazon forest. So there's really a geopolitics involved here of, it's always nicer to say, why don't you do the work? and I'm going to be fine, you know? So it's a complex, it's a complex agenda here, because source of emissions is different in the industrialized country and in the developing country. So something that's really popular and become more popular, and I put that in category first risk. I think that's a risk. I'm getting more concerned with this thing every day. It's the offset risk. Okay, so from a land-based thing, this is how the thinking started. This book, The Economy of Climate Change, or known also as the Stern Review, was published by Sir Nicholas Stern in 2005 at the request of Her Majesty the Queen. And he looked at how could the UK stop or reduce emissions. What would be the pathway? Is Sir Nicholas Stern's an economist. And a key conclusion of his book was to say the cheapest and most effective way to combat climate change is to stop deforestation in developing countries. To which I like to add, probably Sir Nicholas Stern was a brilliant economist, but certainly has not done a lot of field work in places where I do in the tropics. So it's probably easier when you're in an office in London to say it's easy if you're Brazil to stop deforestation than if you actually are Brazil. Okay, so I think, but anyway, that people loved it. You see why? Why did people love that? Okay, Sir Nicholas Stern is talking to US, Canada, Europe, and they're all like, yes, wonderful, the cheapest and most efficient way. Let's do that. We're going to give them some money and they're going to address that. And then we can keep our oil industry alive and well. And so that gave rise to this RED project. So that stands for Reducing Emission from Deforestation and Forest Degradation in Developing Countries. So this is the mechanism of the UN Climate Change Conference to transfer money from developed country to developing country in order for developing country to tackle land use. So it's a kind of an offset. I'm not doing much, but I'm giving you money and you're going to do something. And together we're going to reduce emissions. It's been receiving a lot of money. I'm not sure that it's been extremely successful, but I'm going to show you a slide in 1 or 2 slides so you can judge for yourself. In policy, things morph. So this RED, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation, morphed more recently in 2017 in this new thing called Natural Climate Solution. And this is in the mouth of everybody in Canada now. Natural Climate Solution basically will solve it out. I'm making irony now. But people love this thing, you know. So Natural Climate Solution is basically the thinking of this paper was to say, and to some extent, they're quite right. The only technology that exists today that could remove carbon dioxide at a large planetary scale, what is it? Well, it's photosynthesis. That's it, that's all. There's not any other. And we saw at the beginning, how big is the income, you know, how big is the negative flux, the flux of photosynthesis pumping carbon dioxide. So basically what these guys are saying is, okay, let's do it. You know, let's just use plant to clean up our mess. And so this graph is trying to show business as usual with emissions going up because nobody wants to stop using fossil fuel. And then in green, this is what the biosphere can do for us. And that's why I put that in the offset risk, because more and more I'm thinking, and other colleagues are thinking, that this is a bit of magical thinking. And yet it's becoming a massive sink for resources. And it's preventing us from facing what we should, which is get rid of fossil fuel. And I hope this slide would convey what I want to say. Again, a slide of the Global Carbon Project. So this time I left it the way it looks normally. It's more serious than me with my little birds and plants. So look at what's going on. So this is fossil fuel emissions. The little blip downward in 2020, it's the pandemic. So don't raise your hope. It's not because we've managed to do that. So it's slowing down, maybe globally a little bit, but it's certainly very high still. And these are the emissions from land use. So if you're looking, I guess you're engineers, so you understand graphs, like when I talk to community, they don't like to read graphs, but you have graphs all the time. Well, if you have to choose, where will you put your offset, or where will you put your energy in terms of resolving a problem? And these two figures, the gray and the yellow, are the two flip side of the coin of your figure. Well, I suppose you will go for the gray. And you will say, well, that's the problem, right? Not the land use emissions. The land use emissions are flattish with a slight downward trend. So that tells two things. In terms of an accelerating problem, that doesn't seem to be it. If you look at the scale in terms of flux, the scale goes to 20. It's the scale for fossil fuel goes to 40. So in terms of intensity, overall, it's less important. So for me, this graph shows that it's hardly worth all of that extraordinary magical thought that natural climate solutions are going to get us out of that. And we started all of that red work in 2005. So it's 15 years. So the last bit. So in terms of efficiency, I don't know if you would agree with me that the millions that we spend, well, maybe they did a bit of something, but they certainly were not very efficient. So in this figure, I want to bring you down now to the land sink, because I'm not sure, I don't see all my slides, but soon. Anyway, I'm going to move away from offset risk 1 to offset to risk 2. And risk 2 is related to the land sink. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide that is taken up. So the big green arrow of the beginning. And what we're seeing is the land sink was increasing. But since 2000, the land sink is very variable year to year. It's very climate driven, but it's stopped growing. Okay. We think it grew at the beginning because more carbon dioxide accelerated to some extent plant growth to a certain limit. We know it doesn't do that for a long time. And we're seeing now that this land sink is slowing down. What does it mean it's slowing down? Well, the land sink is the green arrow that's helping us. It's pumping us carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's doing that less now. So that's the real concern. So now I'm in, this is not well, I'm still under offset risk, I guess. So to finish this risk of offset, this is a very new report that was just published during COP27. It's called the Land Gap Report. So if you want to know more about those things, it's a good report. And what this report is saying is that, with this new fad of offsetting emissions from oil on the land, instead of cutting the demand of oil, it's saying we're running out of land to do all of that. So the red line here is the planetary boundary for permanent cropland as of FAO. Okay, so FAO said, if we want to protect nature and ecosystem and all of that and the ban, we should not cultivate more than, 1,300 million hectares. So this here are all kind of pledges and projection. These are the pledges of country only. If we look, under the Climate Change Convention, country pledge, I will reduce my emissions, and I will do that doing this A, B, C, D. If you sum the pledges of every country, this is the land use emission pledges. So we need land for that because it's largely, I'm going to reforest. And this is BECCS. So I don't know if you've heard of BECCS. It's very popular in Canada. So BECCS is this thing. We need to go carbon neutral. but we still want to produce oil because we're an oil producing country. We don't want to change that. So we're going to produce oil, and then we're going to capture the carbon dioxide from the oil production, and we're going to store that below ground. But in order, they say, I'm not saying that, in order, they say, to be clean, we're going to take biofuel to operate the plant that will take up the carbon dioxide. So if we use biofuel, we're not putting fuel in the ground. And so the process of cleaning the production of oil becomes clean. So basically, if you want to be cynical, you're going to cut forests, to burn the forest, to capture carbon dioxide, to store it underground so you can still produce oil that is full carbon. So there's a really big problem with that, and that's huge. So if you add the pledges of land use, plus the range of expectation of BECCS in North America in particular, but in other oil-producing countries, we're getting in a space that is completely unsustainable. We just don't have enough land to feed the world, use forests to produce oil, but for which we would remove the carbon dioxide of the production cycle, and reforest to offset our other activities. And of this picture, nobody yet has calculated the offset of the international civil aviation. So international civil aviation agreed as a group that the emission from aviation should not exceed that of 2020. When they agreed on that, they did not know there was a pandemic. And now there was a pandemic in 2020, they did not fly, but now they're binded to limit their emissions and offset any emissions above the 2020. And it's starting in 2023, next year. So now what we're seeing in the tropics is a race to reforestation so that airplane company can fly and plant trees to offset their emissions. And again, there's not enough land to do that, first. And second, it doesn't tackle the problem at its source, which is the use of fossil fuel. So that's why I say it's a risk maybe you guys need to be thinking about. And this is the last part of this offset thing. What's really perverse in all of that, and I've tried to mention that a few times, it's that there's a timeline when we understand and talk about forests. So in the world of offset, you have an emission, it's now. You take a plane, your emission is now. You're in the airplane and the fossil fuel is burnt now. So if you buy a reforestation offset, you're saying my flight was 1 ton, 1 megagram carbon dioxide. I'm going to pay for 1 megagram offset. Sounds good, but it's not good. You're going to plant a tiny little tree that's going to take 80 years to grow. Your flight today will be carbon neutral in 80 years, not today. So climate does not know, oh, I should not warm up by this little emission. It was offsetted. No. Climate will not do that. So there's a really big misunderstanding in the policies and the markets that are in place. I think that these are pushing up towards my next risk. And this is the scary one. The first one is a kind of a human error and human attitude. This is a biosphere problem. And I called it the tipping point risk. Okay, so I love this paper. If you're into biology, you could read that. I'm not a co-author, so I'm not doing any publicity for myself. So these authors, they looked at the countries of the Amazon basin, and they calculated 3 things at the country level. So this in green, it's the net flux of intact forests. So that's the negative flux, the flux of uptake. The red is the positive flux, which I know it's always confusing because positive is negative, negative is positive. So that's the flux from land use change. This is burning the Amazon. This is Brazil, okay? you see that although people all finger point at Brazil, over the time period of this study, 30 years from 1980 to 2010, still the Amazon was positive. In fact, if you sum the emissions from fossil fuel of Brazil plus the emissions from deforestation, Amazon stoked it all up and the country was neutral, right? So these fluxes are very, very powerful. Okay, so globally that matters, from a carbon viewpoint that matters. So that's the good news. I mentioned that at the beginning. We should be paying attention to those big, huge tropical sinks and to the boreal sinks as well. This is the bad news. This is what has been happening to the strength of the sink through time in the countries of the Amazon. And you see that at the end of the 1990s, it started to decline. Forests everywhere in the world are now slowly turning from a carbon sink to a carbon source. And that's very scary. So what's happening here? I'm sorry, the slide is a bit fuzzy. So as the climate is warming up, the forests that have developed over a climate, a given temperature range and humidity range are now experiencing a very different temperature regime. So with climate change, we see temperature rising. And with temperature rising, we have an increase in drought and in forest fire. And this is happening throughout the Amazon. So as it's becoming dry and as there's more fire, more trees die and they decompose or they burn. And as they die, they decompose and they burn, they release their carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as they're releasing their carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they induce or contribute to this rise in temperature. And on the other hand, to make matter worse, the fewer rainforest there is, the less water there is, because the forest recycles the water. And so as there's less forest, there's less rainfall, and there should be a loop here. And as there's less rainfall, the forests die and so on. So there's ecosystems, forest ecosystems have begun to start looping themselves on negative feedback. So basically, to be blunt, forests are dying in the world. Remember a little bit, you've heard that. Amazon's burning, Canada's burning, Australia's burning, California's burning. What burning means, carbon dioxide is released and the sink gets slower. So the IPCC has identified tipping points. What are tipping points? I'm sure in catastrophe, you must know all of tipping points, but we in ecology, we also manage tipping points. So tipping points is, an ecosystem as a way of functioning. And then sometimes something happens, which is catastrophic. So that's good for you. And it completely disrupts the systems. So the IPCC has identified 9 tipping points. I like to say these are the things you absolutely must avoid. You must avoid because the consequences of those tipping points are such that you can't do anything about that. And look at that. In Canada, we are the host of 2 of the biological tipping points, with tropical forests or Amazonian forests being the 3rd one. Why? Because these are the terrestrial ecosystem with the largest stocks of carbon. So if the temperature goes too warm, all of that peat in the permafrost gets released in the atmosphere. The boreal forest fires and pests are destroying the boreal forests. And in the Amazon, it's the frequent drought. And unfortunately, this is already happening. We cannot say it's not, and it could be, maybe. It is already beginning to happen. So we're not anymore saying, oh, there's a tipping point later. No. We're already walking at the beginning of this tipping point. And so if you can remember how much carbon there is in the terrestrial biosphere, you're going to be as scared as I am, I hope. And so I don't know if you followed climate change with as much passion as I have, but the first assessment report of the climate change was in 1992. And the IPCC then said, we think that maybe some human activity are possibly causing a problem with climate. That was the name, you know, like every word was a maybe, possibly, we think, you were not sure. Well, in the last assessment report, which hasn't been released, but the draft is circulating around, it's on the website, you can see it. It says that it's unequivocal that we're heating the climate. And the changes are rapid, intensifying, and unprecedented. And then they talk about, the main risks and impact, and there you go. Tree mortality and wildfire that leads to carbon loss. And they are ranked, with very high probability. So I think we have a sort of a real obligation to act. At least I'm completely frightened by this time, because I don't think that the policy response understands the implication of what is happening all around us. And so if you wonder, are there data to show me that the Canadian forests, what are they doing? Okay, so if you're going downward here, you're a net sink, okay? You're taking up carbon dioxide. This is the Canadian forest data from the Canadian Forest Service, okay? So Canadian forests were a big sink. They were picking up carbon dioxide. This is why there's so much carbon stored in Canadian forests. That's the boreal. Well, since 2002, I'm sorry, Canadian forests are a net source. Canadian forests are now an enemy of climate change. And so I'm going to loop back to the first risk, which is this offset risk. Do you understand what we're trying to do? We're trying to fix a problem with a problem. We're trying to say the biosphere will save us. No, the biosphere needs us to save her. Like ecosystems are not able to cope with this climate change already. And for Canadian boreal, its evidence is absolutely unequivocal. My last slide, I've decided a few times back that I'm going to stop like this, calling every one of us to think about our own action. And that paper I really like, Wine and Nicholas, because it's what can each of us do. In my case, having one fewer child, it's over with. I have 3 and that's it. I cannot have one less. But here are the other options. This paper is about the single individual action that matters most to the future of the planet. Living a car-free life, avoid one transatlantic flight, buy green energy, and use a more efficient car. So I'd like to leave you on this. This is your homework after my talk. Thank you very much. Maybe I should stop sharing slide, or do I leave the slide, or what do I do?
Well, why don't you leave it there for a moment, because you might have to, we have no questions in the Q&A box, but I have some questions that you might want to explain, give the answer in terms of something on your slide.
Yeah.
So this is, first of all, this is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I have learned more about climate change in the last 48 minutes than I knew beforehand. I'm very grateful. But there was a lot of information there. And I've got a bunch of questions here. And the most pressing one was just, okay, so right at the end, you said that Canadian boreal forests have become a net source of carbon. And maybe because I was thinking just before you said that, I missed how that happened. But could you explain that one more time, please?
Yeah, 2 things. Forest fires have intensified greatly, and bark pine beetle. So bark pine beetle was always a problem in Canada. It was an endemic beetle, but the winters were cold enough to kill enough beetles to keep the population in check. Now the winters are not cold enough. And so instead of having cycles of population that goes up and then goes down and then grow again, and now it's just full growth. So now bark pine beetle is just devastating, completely devastating. And so that's why our forests have stopped to play a positive role. It is more something from central Canada westward so far in, and I don't want to be like, I'm not going to go this road, but so far, in the east, we're still okay. But it's temporary, let's face it, it's in the east, the western Canada has been hit much harder.
Okay, thank you. And the that clears up that question. But it might raise in some of our audience's minds the thought that, oh, well, we have to fix the problem with our own boreal forests being net producers of carbon by suppressing forest fires. And we've heard in some of our past speakers saying that's just not possible. We cannot suppress our way out of forest fires. That's not the way the forest works. Fires are natural. The more you suppress today's fire, the bigger the fire you're creating for tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's correct. The way we would argue what we have to do is we have to begin very actively, I would say, assisted regeneration or assisted restoration. So here are some things that I find useful. The climate analog for Montreal at the end of this century is Pennsylvania. Okay, what does that mean? It means in Montreal, my grandchildren at the end of the century, they will live under a climate of Pennsylvania now. Think about that. Have you ever go sugar bushing in Pennsylvania? No. You don't go to produce maple syrup in Pennsylvania. The maple trees don't thrive in Pennsylvania. They have liquid ambar and all sorts of other things, all sorts of other species. But the speed at which this climate transition will happen is too fast for trees. Like trees don't migrate from Pennsylvania to Quebec in 60 years. It takes thousands of years for the vegetation to follow climate. It eventually does, like when with the ice age, the vegetation, when the ice age was very high, all the vegetation retreated, south to Florida. And then as the ice cap melted, the vegetation came back up. But that's thousands of years. So what we think we need to do now is work on our forest to introduce species of the future. And because we're not exactly sure what are the species of the future, it means we need to just sprinkle lots of species based on our best knowledge so that we help the forest develop its own resilience.
Got it. But that, of course, carries with it the offset risk that you talked about before. If we're planting trees all over the place to accelerate but
it's not an offset. The offset is when you're saying, I'm canceling this emission by this action. Now, I'm not talking about offset. I just think we need a nursing, like the program of nurturing forests for forest's sake. And we should do that for the forest because they were a great help to the biosphere. And I don't think it should be an offset. I think we should aggressively limit the emissions at the same time. And unless we do that, we're in deep trouble.
And right. Okay. So this nourishing, I don't remember the term. Nurturing. That does not appear in this menu of options for us, though, does it?
I know. I thought you wanted to hear about catastrophe, not solutions to catastrophe.
No, I do want to hear about solutions. Absolutely. I mean, the last two questions I have, two questions I have on my little notes here, I wrote down right before you put the slide up. Some of us work in businesses where we have some say in how we're going to help the climate, right? And like we decided that we're going to buy carbon offsets for all of our, our air travel, and thought that made us carbon, thought we could claim to be carbon neutral. And
I tell you what you could do that would work. And I not too long ago, I talked with the VP sustainability for a big, airline company, and I said, buy public transport buses. Invest in public transport. All the cities are not having enough buses to offer, choose. Do you want to invest in intercity transport? Come on, in Canada, we cannot go anywhere between cities. It's abyssal. If in Europe you have trains, you can move. Well, here, and so displace your emission of flying with a fuel emission. Stay within your sector. That will work. That will be sustainable. But don't start planting trees. It does not work.
Okay, so stay within your sector, meaning don't travel as far?
No, stay within your sector with an offset. So if your emission is an emission on traveling, it's an emission that's caused by using fossil fuel. Find an offset that decreases fossil fuels somewhere else. Doesn't need to be in Canada. It can be something else, somewhere else.
Gotcha.
But it should displace the oil. That's what we want.
I understand.
Now, if you're a lumber industry, it's, you're cutting trees, you can replant trees, but then you need to factor in the time frame. So
Right.
for everything you cut, you need much more land.
Right, I understand. So sometimes, in addition to sort of acting as agents of our own corporations, to manage make our own corporate decisions, sometimes we act as advocates to the federal government.
Maybe they listen to you more than me. You never know.
Well, I think that more voices saying the same thing, the more diverse those voices. If the scientists are saying the exact same thing as the insurance industry, which is saying blah, 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 I think that more people saying the same thing from more different directions sort of sinks in more with the government. So in our role as advocates, to the country, to the federal government, what should I, as an employee of ICLR, what do you think I should be telling my boss, the executive director of ICLR, Paul Kovacs? What should I be telling him that we should be telling the federal government? Go ahead.
It's just so urgent to reduce the use of fossil fuel. It should just stop turning around that. I was in a meeting of the Global Carbon Project in 2002. Okay, that's 20 years ago. And I remember that at some point in the discussion, the executive director of the Global Carbon Project said, well, we know what to do, right? Close the tap. Yes. Yeah, we know, close the tap. That's it. We need to close the tap. But instead, the land and this natural climate solution is now playing this role of diversion because people think that's easier. They don't have to change their way of life. And it's nice, and it's nature and biodiversity and water protection, which is all true, except it's not solving climate change. Right. So to solve climate change, we just need to stop using fossil fuel. And the biggest threat now is, for me in Canada, is this threat of BECCS. And I'm going to try to explain it again.
Please.
So this BECCS thing. So you produce, if you're the oil industry, your out product, what you're selling, is full of carbon dioxide. That's basically what's killing the planet. Okay, so this product should not be burnt anymore. I mean, maybe you can produce oil for plastics, that they're useful. I mean, there's many property for oil-derived compound. If you're engineers, you know that better than me. But burning that stuff is killing the planet. That's clear. So BECCS is not cleaning the end product. The end product of an oil industry with carbon capture and storage is as dirty as the end product of the oil industry now. Okay, so what we don't want on the long run is to be able to use that end product. So now what the industry is doing is they're saying, I'm going to clean my footprint of my industrial operation by doing carbon capture and storage. So that will improve their operation, but that will not improve the end product. If you are in a hydro province, you can do BECCS with hydroelectricity. That will clean your operation. It's fine. What the government then needs to ask themselves is that the best use of the hydroelectricity? Because we also have to use electricity for cars, for other industry, and so on and so far. So there's an allocation that factor that the government would have to do. But technically, the production of oil with carbon capture and storage fueled by solar or wind or hydro, the production itself would be clean. In Canada, the oil production, it's 37% of our emission. So it would reduce significantly Canada's emission, but it would not help the global problem of access, still having this toxic compound, which is oil used in transportation. But in Alberta, they don't have hydroelectricity. They don't.
Right.
So they've been thinking, okay, how can we do carbon capture and storage without it hydro? And they said, okay, BECCS. I'm told that in BC currently, they're cutting down forests to change the forest in wood pellets, to use wood pellets as the source of energy for BECCS, for carbon capture and storage. But that doesn't work. It's the same as the reforestation. You're cutting a huge stalk and you're burning it immediately. And the forests in BC are very old forests, 150, 200 years, 300 years. So it's going to be carbon neutral in 150, 200, 300 years. Not now. Not now. And so this is very critically misunderstanding and very scary because it's part of all the modeling of the federal government. And, there's more and more people going now, wow, wait a minute, this is not working. Scientists are starting to say, wait a minute, we're losing the sink of the forest. The forest stops to play its role. And the replacement time is too long. So I think that that's something that we need to restate to the government is this, we should just we're an intelligent country full of people with talents. Let's face it, this is not the future. Let's get out of that and invest our technologies and brain in other ways. Alberta is very rich in solar energy. I mean, they could be solar kings. Well, why not do that? That would be much more intelligent.
I've got a couple of comments to read to you, but before I do that, I want to just clarify for you. I'm an engineer, but most of our attendees today are insurance professionals. They're people who manage the business of homeowners insurance and that sort of thing, and they understand actuarial science and stuff like that. But they're in the insurance world. So I wanted to let you know that, and I also want to turn to the audience here and say, I can see Professor Potvin's presentation from through an engineer's eyes, but I can't really see it through an insurance professional's eyes. So do please help the professor and me and the other attendees understand how what she's talking about relates to the insurance industry.
So I will say something about the insurance industry. Please. If you think climate change has been bad, it's nothing compared to what's waiting us if the forests release their carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's why we talk about tipping point, because it's going to bring us in a world completely uncharted in terms of the intensity. And that's why I wanted to bring you this image to begin with of 1 kilometer of ice with minus 1.5 degree. If you're an insurance company, that must make you react, right? So, and we're talking end of the century. That intensity of change in climate, that's if we are good citizens. 1.5 plus 1.5. And so imagine if we're not good citizens, how fast and how bad this is going to change.
I understand. Let me read to you a couple of comments that our attendees have offered. Scott Davis says, this has been a real eye-opener. Thank you, ICLR and Dr. Potvin.
Thank you.
An anonymous attendee says, comment only. So the pandemic has enabled people to work from home and reduce carbon fuel commuting methods. That's an interesting gerund. Could the government or municipalities be providing or encouraging or incentivizing us to maintain virtual work arrangements to avoid companies to force employees to commute back to their offices on a daily basis? And the attendee says employees are telling their employers that they wish to work from home and avoid commuting, but many organizations are forcing or reintroducing back to office, back to work policies now that the pandemic protocols are ending.
Well, maybe you need to get those companies a little bit of basic carbon accounting and reporting, because the companies need to report on their emissions, right? In Canada. And the travel of the employees back and forth to the office is a part of the emission, not of the employee, but of the employer, of the business. So indeed, if you have a commuting friendly employer that allows you to come to work 2 days a week, de facto, you're reducing 3/5 of the carbon emissions of each of your employee, which can become significant. So I think that the pandemic and the virtual, we should use that a lot. Of course, sometimes it's not appropriate. We all need real people contact. But I think it's a really great advantage that we have, and we should do that. And it should be part of the strategies of companies, definitely. And the link is clear, because companies need to account for that in their emissions. So go for it.
Well, thank you so much. We don't have any other questions, but at least not yet. But I have one. I spend a lot of my time trying to advocate for resilience measures. I tried, in a previous life as an earthquake engineer, I told people who live in California, who live in older wood houses, you need to do these 5 things. You need to bolt the house to the foundation. You need to strap furniture to the wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was easy. It made it easy to do that, because I could package all of that in one sentence. I could say, if you want to know how to do this, go to www.secureirspace.org. It was just one-stop shop for all the reasons, all the information, all the to do. And I wonder, is there an equivalent one-stop shop for the stuff you've talked about here, where the people in attendance today can say, I don't remember everything. I remember 10% of what Professor Potvin said, but she said, go to this webpage to refresh all your memory. Is there some resource like that where we can refresh our memory, or perhaps become part of a community to advocate for controlling climate change?
So my first thinking is that no, there's not, which is why I sort of started ending by this slide, to give some general guidance to your own personal, choices in life. So we have so I'm not aware that's a simple one, and maybe that's a suggestion that you can make to the federal government is, go simple. You mentioned earlier that we did this, we had this initiative called Sustainable Canada Dialogue, but it's kind of oldish now. I think our last report was published in 2018. We were motivated probably because during the Harper government, science didn't feel very listened to. So we were motivated by the election and the Paris conference in 2015. But, we've gone quiet now. The reports are still online, but there were more policy oriented than personally oriented. In terms of business, we're trying to do something on a project that's, the website is, I think you say Go Pivot. Maybe I can write that in the chat. And but I don't have the web link, but it's a project with, I'll write the name of the professor. So Dror Etzion at McGill. It's a business professor. And it's for SMEs. I'm not sure if you're big companies or SMEs in your group that are trying to, go sustainable. And, we're trying to provide guidance on, what to do. In particular, we developed a kind of a calculator for small businesses to look at your footprint and which for us is the first step, is try to know where are your emissions and then try to cut those emissions, the highest one, that's, but it's not so comprehensive, I think, and, as what you would like to. So it's a really good suggestion. So hopefully somebody will pick that up and do it.
Great. And the rest of our attendees can't see the webinar chat. That's just for you and me and Mike.
So maybe you can forward that.
Yeah, I'm actually putting it into the Q&A right now, into the second, the second question, which I just read to you. Oops, and then I clicked and it went away. For people who want those two names, look in the answered tab of the Q&A box, and you'll see Go Pivot and Dror Etzion. So the next, another attendee, anonymous attendee asks, or maybe the same one, what's being done or promoted at the municipal government level to avoid clear-cutting forests to build residential neighborhoods? But, and the commenter says, while also trying to solve housing shortages.
Yeah, so I think this is probably provincial by provinces because, municipal governments belong to provincial government, not a federal one. I can only speak to Quebec because I'm a member of the Quebec Consultative Committee on Climate Change. So we advise the Minister of Environment. That doesn't mean he listens or reacts on what we say, but at least we say it. And what we asked him to do, which he hasn't done yet, is to declare a moratorium on the conversion of any, natural landscapes. So we don't think that you could do that. You don't think that at the moment where forest is experiencing extreme pressure, getting rid of forest is a good thing. So I think that densification, and I think in general, people like me who work on climate change, we do think that densification of urban space is what you have to do. So you have to have denser urban space with some green space in between for, the heat island effect. But yeah, that's the way to go, and not keep cutting trees to build houses instead.
Awesome. And I think it's the same attendee who says, further to the comment above, is it true that building up high rises are better for the environmental impact than broad, expansive housing developments? And I think you've just said the answer is yes, right?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I would say that furthermore, intelligent neighborhoods, neighborhoods where you have your stores, your school, your leisurely activity, where you can live in your neighborhood without having a car. That's the future. So dense and offering the necessary service that you need every day. The shopping mall suburban is not the way to go if you want to tackle climate change, definitely.
Thank you. I want to turn now. I mean, we've got about 15 minutes left. We have no further questions from our audience, and I have no further questions that are worth asking of you, Professor. But I want to turn to the audience and ask you what your opinion of what is your opinion of the role of the real practical role of ICLR's membership? I mean, are we talking about something that is just that you personally can't see yourself taking some action on just because of your role in the company or some instructions from the company? Is this something that is practical for you or is not practical for you? I mean, what are you taking away from this? Are you getting a sense of, I'm going to take some action? And if so, what is it? And if the answer is no, can you tell us why? Just type your response into the Q&A box.
Oh, I have a naive question while people are writing. Isn't it normal that people don't write questions? Is that like that for everybody? Or is it because the topic is so foreign?
It's not. It's definitely not boring. It is distant from what we do day to day.
Okay.
It's, I think each of us as individuals is aware of the climate crisis. I think that this seminar has selected for the membership that is interested in the climate crisis, right? I mean, the people who aren't here. But there is this gap between what we do in our day-to-day lives and what you're telling us.
Sure.
And this last slide is perfect. I'm so glad that you ended on this last slide because this is my takeaway here. But there's a lot to absorb here and a lot to think about. And I just like a sense from the audience whether they're still mulling or they have reached some conclusion, what their thoughts are. But since I'm not getting any responses here, I think at this point we can adjourn. Oh, here's one. Anonymous attendee says, honestly, it's always cost and expense based. Sadly, if a more environmental option is available to adjust a claim or for a contractor to take to rebuild a repair, that will be taken to save money. The only difference will be governmental intervention. So I think the attendee is saying all of the actions that we as insurers do are entirely driven by what saves money. The only way that the insurance industry, I think this is what the attendee is saying, the only flexibility, the freedom that the insurance industry has here is by advocating for governmental information. Oh, and he says, he or she says, yes, sorry, typing too fast. Unless we've got other perspectives here, I think it's time to thank you, Professor Potvin. This has been one of my favorite talks of the past year. I very much enjoyed it. I just want to remind our audience that the professor's talk, we will be distributing her slide deck on PDF over the next either today or Monday, and a YouTube video of this webinar will be posted again either this afternoon or at the latest by Monday. And remind everyone once again that next month we have two exciting talks. One on a new mathematical model of wildfire damage on January 13th, and another about climate disclosure information for businesses, which seems to relate to Catherine's talk today. Those are on January 13th and January 27th. I wish everyone a happy holidays, a happy new year, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the new year. Thank you very much.
Happy New Year. Have a good holiday season.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.